little too aggressive to start out with, but just something to think about in terms of creating an irrevocable trust that you can transfer assets out of your estate during your life, but with the potential, so a SLAT is a spousal lifetime access trust, but with the potential for another family member to still have access to those assets. And I don't want to go into these in too much detail, but just giving you some examples of some more complex planning that you can do up front, especially if you have an asset that you anticipate will appreciate. I also see some clients, and especially as we consider the fact that interest rates will likely be coming down in the upcoming 12 months or continue coming down in the upcoming 12 months. Sometimes clients will use something like a grantor retained annuity trust. And essentially with this, a client would put assets into this GRAT. It essentially works like an annuity. So the grantor who put the assets into the trust would get an annuity payment back based on a fixed IRS hurdle rate, so an interest rate. So as that interest rate comes down, the hurdle rate for appreciation of the assets is lower, which allows more to remain in the trust to continue in the GRAT to continue to grow while the grantor takes back that fixed annuity payment. And so the excess appreciation will just pass tax free to the beneficiaries when the trust terminates. A lot of information there. Don't expect anybody to digest that entirely. The point just being there are different types of tools that you should talk with your financial advisor and estate planning attorney about, even in advance of the price appreciation, because with a lot of these tools, the point is to get assets out of your estate before they appreciate. And so doing some of that planning up front can definitely be appropriate in certain situations.
Well, I just want to touch on the disclaimer, probably since you mentioned it. The information in this podcast is for educational, general in nature, and it's not supposed to be taken as consideration for the listener's personal circumstance. So therefore, it is not intended to be a substitute for specific individual financial, legal, or tax advice. In order for you to determine which of these strategies or investments may be suitable for you, it's always best to consult with the appropriate qualified professional prior to making any financial decisions. So, you know how it is. We have to let them know, there's all these tools, right? And there's a red flag for me is when an advisor seems super hung up on a specific tool and they want to, like, if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, you know? I think that we should always, and we do value-based planning. I'm really proud of the culture that we have at our multifamily office, providing clients exactly what they need and not trying to stick them into something that is in our benefit. We always want to sit on the side of the client's table and make sure that whatever we're doing is in their long-term and best interest. But there's all these different tools, and some may be appropriate for some people at certain times and other people at other times. So it's difficult, without specific information or context to give people exactly the best one or the few options that may be the best options for them at the time. You didn't touch on ILETs, but I think, that's an interesting topic, and I don't want to gloss over that one, especially when it comes to digital assets. I think that there's going to be a possibility in the near term, next year or two, where you're able to draw down debt at a fairly reasonable interest rate against your digital assets, and then be able to fund an ILET with premium financing,
Yep.
To be able to, mitigate the tax implications that you would have for transferring those assets in. So that's complex. Again, this is probably a little bit higher level than some people are used to, but I think it'd be interesting for people to go through what an ILET is and how that can be used in their estate planning.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. I've seen, especially in situations, I know I mentioned illiquidity earlier, but especially in situations where maybe a client has a lot of their assets tied up in a family business or tied up in digital assets that they don't want to sell down the road, or any asset really that they don't want to sell. Maybe they have a lot of their wealth tied up in real estate. An ILET can be an essential tool in this case just to provide cash flow upon a client's passing. And again, like you mentioned, very tax efficient, directly to the trust that owns the life insurance policy. So outside of probate, and tax efficient wealth transfer there. So I entirely agree that can become a critical piece of a client's estate plan.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. We haven't done a ton of those, but again, it hasn't been super applicable for the larger majority of our client base. So kind of stepping back again, at a high level, what do you think the order of operations is? So let's say, somebody has been proactive and structured these things. They are starting to scout other professionals. and maybe look at more complex estate planning? In what order should they go through that for all the different components of a family office?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing I would say is interview multiple family offices. Sorry, Jake, I know that digital centric group
No,
and digital family
I,
offices.
I encourage that. I want people, and the main piece of a lot of the content that we put out is I just want people to be educated and understand these things so that when you're having the conversations, even if you're not going to work with us over the long term, you're not going to be taken advantage of by somebody else. You're educated enough on the topic that you can understand what's going on, even if it is a bit more complex, and make sure that your wealth is going to be managed effectively over the long term.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, the first thing that I would recommend would be interviewing not only multiple family offices, multiple different advisors potentially at the family office, multiple attorneys, multiple CPAs. Definitely ask them about their background, the types of families that they work with. But at the end of the day, you're really just looking for the right fit. These people that you're going to put on your team are truly going to become part of your family. You'll probably talk to them just as much as some of your family members, and they're going to be ingrained in every part of your life. Even though it might start just as financial, it oftentimes becomes much more than that. And so I think the first part is making sure, or the first step is making sure that you create the right team around you and foster a lot of trust and communication and transparency with that team that you build. From there, I'd say, obviously, the closest relationship you'll likely have is with your family office or financial advisor. And I would start with discussing goals. So, obviously, you'll do a lot of fact finding up front, a lot of information gathering, know what types of structures you have in place already, go through your balance sheet, net worth statement, create a financial plan. But it's really going to be setting those goals and discussing different ways that you can attain those goals, whether it's creating a charity or a donor advised fund, a foundation, or making sure that you leave behind XYZ amount for your children, your grandchildren, making sure that you set up some type of trust that's only geared toward education funding or used to create a business for future generations or something like that. So, really, it's getting the right team around you, setting up goals, and then discussing the strategies to attain those goals.
Yeah, I think that's a great order of operations there. And again, it's hard to go through like the exact specifics for what would be appropriate to each person because there's a lot of context that's required for that.
Yeah.
Um, at what net worth do you think it's appropriate for people to start looking at bill pay and concierge service or the philanthropic planning? From my experience, it's been around that $30 million mark on the philanthropic side, because that is going to be the gift tax threshold here in the US in 2026. Between you and your spouse, you both get 15 million. Anything above and beyond that's going to be taxed at 40% on the estate tax if it's passed through. So if assets have appreciated beyond that before they've been put into a structure to be able to mitigate those tax implications, that's where I see people, like you mentioned, a DAF, donor advised fund, or a charitable remainder trust or a family foundation. I think those are applicable there. But on the bill pay and the accounting, like what again, do you think that's really around the $20 million mark? And it does it need to be just more complex than just one entity that you're dealing with?
I would say it definitely needs to be a little bit more complex. The bill pay side of things, and this is just speaking from my personal experience, certainly there can be instances where maybe $30 million or $20 million makes sense. Just speaking from my personal experience, I've seen that come into play when there's typically significantly more wealth, when the situation becomes more complex. So looking at the $50 million range, even in some cases, maybe even up to your point of a liquidity event and 100 million, when assets start to transfer from being managed within a business to now being managed on your personal side of things. And so that could definitely be something that comes into play there. But I would say typically it's with higher net worth, so maybe even more than $30 million.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, any other components of a family office that you feel are, a high level just overview that maybe we skipped over or people should be thinking about as they're going through this?
Yeah, and this is gonna be less on the financial side of things or thinking about just, assets under management in dollars. But I think that when we consider integrating a family office or doing any legacy planning, obviously, my family's complicated. I think families in general are complicated. So while the structural foundation, I think, is obviously crucial. I think it's also important to work with families more on the human side of things. And so I think aside from just setting financial goals, it's also important to set family goals. And so, like I said, on the human side of things. So, one component of that is really talking to the family overall and defining what wealth means to the family outside of just what wealth means in terms of money or dollars. And so that can be, and I read this book, and I know I've talked to you about it, Jake, before, but I read a book called Family Wealth, and Family Wealth, keeping it in the family. And I think that that book does a great job addressing how a family office can help client families structure legacy planning that is considerate of not just that financial capital, but human capital in terms of their physical and emotional well-being, how they find meaningful work, how they establish a positive sense of self-identity, and how they pursue their own happiness so that they contribute to the family legacy from that perspective. I think another aspect that comes up there is intellectual capital. So how you ensure that your family has the right life experiences, that you make sure you digest what other family members know before, you're taking on all of the responsibility of the family. That can be academic, it could be career growth, it could be artistic, it could be philanthropic, but really just making sure that the family's always learning from each other. There's another piece of it that's spiritual capital. That term can be a little bit confusing because it's not necessarily religious or what somebody's individual personal thoughts are on spirituality, but really it's more about creating a shared dream with the family, and knowing that there are going to be challenges along the way, but that exceed the strength of just one individual member of the family. But instead, when you work as a whole, that's really how the family will find success. And then they talk about a social capital. So just interacting with family members and community in a healthy and productive way. And then obviously we'll always circle back to the financial capital piece of it. But I think having a family office who brings in that human aspect alongside the financial aspect because of their deep understanding